As we are thinking about the journey of faith, about our experiences in life, and the things that we encounter in this world, we are thinking about the bread that we find along our travels that can renew our strength and give us direction. And we are searching for bread for our travels in the wisdom and the guidance of the Psalms. Because the Psalms speak to and reflect every experience, every emotion known to humanity. That people have been there before, that God has heard those cries before. Those prayers have been said by others and now are said by us. And when we think about a journey, there are those immediate crises where we cry out. But then there is also those longings over the long haul, the things that we yearn for, that we hope for, the feeling in the pit of our stomach that says to us something is missing, or we need a change of scenery, or we need to pause and rest and regain our sense of direction. There are those sense of longings along the way. If you have ever driven through a mountain range where the car is winding back and forth, slowly going up and down, we look out the window and it is a beautiful landscape. Mountains surrounding us, perhaps snow on the ridge in front of us. But all of that twisting and turning up and down can make us almost car sick, to where we need to pull over and get a breath of fresh air, that we long for something different. Or maybe it's that last bus ride home on the final afternoon of a week at Disney World, where we have been standing out in line in 90-degree weather, where we have put so many miles on our shoes that we cannot count them, that it has been a wonderful week of ice cream cones and roller coasters, but as we plop down on that bench in the bus and ride back to our hotel one last time, we're longing for something different. It's time to go back to the routine of work and the comforts of home. That there are those longings on each and every journey if we listen to them. And Psalm 62 is about that longing, that listening to the still small voice of God that accompanies us along the way. There are three sections to Psalm 62. The first one is verses 1 through 4, where the psalmist writes, "For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall never be shaken. How long will you assail a person? Will you batter your victim? All of you, as you would a leaning wall, a tottering fence. Their only plan is to bring down a person of prominence. They take pleasure in falsehood. They bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse." The psalmist describes a threat from without, hardship and fear and obstacles all around us. But the psalmist makes a commitment to look towards God, where there is refuge and rest and renewal to be found. And then in the second section, verses 5 through 10, the psalmist says this, "For God alone my soul waits in silence. For my hope is from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken. On God rests my deliverance and my honor, my mighty rock. My refuge is in God. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. Those of low estate are but a breath. Those of high estate are a delusion. In the balances they go up. They are together lighter than a breath. Put no confidence in extortion, and set no vain hopes on robbery. If riches increase, do not set your heart on them. That when we face those moments of duress, as we continue to look towards God, we have to resist the temptation of fighting fire with fire, of responding out of our fear, of responding with violence or resentment, like robbery, taking what we think we need. And then in the final section, verses 11 and 12, the psalmist says, once God has spoken, twice have I heard this, that power belongs to God, and steadfast love belongs to you, O Lord, for you repay to all according to their work. That the reason we trust in God, the reason we look towards God in our longing, is because of that true strength we find in God. That God's love is for us. But it's interesting how the psalmist in the first couple sections continues to focus on the waiting in silence for God. And this is not meant to be a passive waiting. It's not even specifically about verbal silence, where we close our mouths and throw away the key. That it's more of a sense of rest. It is a stillness. It describes a quiet soul, where we set aside our fears and our anxieties, and we return our attention to God, finding a sense of wholeness in the stillness of being in God's presence. It reminds us that in this life, there are those things that are outside of our control. That does not mean we are powerless or that we should be completely passive. There are things in this world that we should try to change. But then there are the other things that we try to control even though we cannot. That we fight with them and wrestle with them, but that fighting, it simply gets in our way. That we need to recognize what it is that cannot be changed, and to seek peace within given circumstances. I had a friend years ago who was having trouble helping his son go to sleep at night. And it was a bit of a mystery. His son had always been a very good sleeper. From the first night that they brought him home from the hospital. But over those early years, as his son got a little bit older, he became afraid of the dark. So at bedtime, it became somewhat of a struggle getting him to go to sleep. And my friend said there were only so many stories that he could read, so many cups of water he could go and bring to him, so many times he could check under the bed for monsters, that he couldn't just leave all the lights on because his son was afraid of the dark, because he'd never fall asleep. But he couldn't turn out all the lights because he was afraid and he would never go to sleep either. So he offered his son a choice. He said, I can leave one light on, and I will close the door and leave the room so you can go to sleep. Or I will turn all the lights off, but I'll stay right here, sitting on the end of the bed until you fall asleep. And his son asked his dad to stay in the room and that he could turn off all of the lights. That his son chose presence in the darkness over absence in the light. That as we go through the difficult valleys before us, knowing that God is present with us can give us strength to go through those things we cannot avoid. That God's presence in the darkness might be enough. That God is our refuge, our salvation, our fortress. It can be hard to see this or experience this or remember this when we're dealing with all of the obstacles in front of us or around us. Because it's hard to be still and to hear God's voice in the midst of all of that. When I was learning to drive as a 15-year-old, wanting to get my license, I was one of those student drivers with the bumper sticker on the back of the car, and my teacher sat in the passenger seat, and on the floorboard he had his own brake pedal. And every time we got in the car before the lesson, we went through the mental checklist. Put your seatbelt on, check. Make sure your hands are on the right place of the wheel, check. And then one thing he always had to remind me of is to check your mirrors, to make sure you can see out of the rear view mirror, the side mirrors, so you can see what's happening behind you. But when it comes to our faith, in the face of those long journeys and those longings that we have along the way, which lead to questions like, how are we going to get through this? How am I going to have enough strength to face this? Am I alone? Is there guidance that yields a way forward? That sometimes we have to look in the rearview mirror. That we have to check our mirrors and look back to remember how God's grace has been with us through the valleys that are already behind us. Because when we are facing obstacles in front of us and around us, it's hard to see. But if we check our mirrors, we can look back. And sometimes it is only then that we realize God's presence was with us in the darkness, that God's grace accompanied us through the valley. And it can assure us in the midst of that longing that we are not alone, that grace will be there for us yet again, that God's presence will anchor us, because God's love is for us as our soul waits in silence for God. Whether that is at the very beginning of a new journey or somewhere in the middle, whether we have been on a journey for so long we cannot even remember when it started, whether the road is bumpy or we are forced to take a detour we never expected. That for God alone, our soul waits in silence. Amen.